one of the things, kind of sets of figures in the Seth Bigelow's paper are a series of curves that show the light saturation of the individual species, these eastern forest species that they studied. And these light saturation curves, if you're not accustomed to reading them, they're showing you the relationship between the maximum rate of photosynthesis for these individual species relative to the amount of light that are reaching the plants. These are helpful things to measure because they give you insight into how tolerant a plant is to shade, an individual tree is to shade, and they also tell you, this is harder to read from Seth's graphs, but it also tells you it gives you some information about the maximum growth rate of these plants. So let me show you a very simple representation of this. And that's in this kind of cartoon graph that I've made up here. I made this up, and it's designed to help illustrate something about what they are showing in their paper. And it's cartoon, it's contrived, but here's what I kind of am trying to illustrate here. This first species has a very steep curve, and it reaches a flat line where adding more light doesn't change photosynthesis. This happens relatively quickly. If you look at this light levels, relative proportion, this species is maxing out really fast. And the thing that's especially relevant to us here, the thing that I want to highlight is that at this point, at this light level, this species is growing faster than the other two that are represented in this cartoon. So what you got is species one reaches a light saturation level really fast, whereas these other two species are more gradual. So the second species is much more gradual, and then the third species here is intermediate between the two. What this means is that in this graph, everything is reaching the same maximum growth rate, but this, species one reaches its maximum growth rate really fast. Species two is slow, and then species three is in the middle. So different, and this is true in a sense. Many different, when you look across species in forests, you will see that different trees reach their maximum growth rates at different levels of light. The species that reach their maximum growth rate the most quickly tend to be more favored in shady conditions. These species can outcompete, and so the species one here can outcompete the other two species at low light levels. It's going to have a faster growth rate. Really advantageous adaptation for growing under the canopy of other trees. Okay. This is, I got some other things here, just kind of acknowledging all plants have variable light requirements, and this rapid light saturation typically indicates shade tolerance. And it just, I think that hopefully that's making sense here. Less rapid light saturation is typical of faster growing plants, and I will come back to that. But just kind of file that away. And so here's their analysis here. Light limitation in trees is a really helpful thing to understand, but it's also quite relative. Certain trees are going to be more limited by light in certain conditions. These, I drew that little cartoon, but their paper shows that this shows empirical evidence to support it. And what you're seeing here is the very steep light saturation curves for American beech and eastern hemlock. The curve is very steep. These trees generally reach their maximum photosynthesis very quickly. And both of these species, even though beech is a broadleaf species and hemlock is a conifer, they both have high shade tolerance. Both species can persist under the canopy of lots of other species within these forests. Now, contrasting that with red maple and then white ash in their analysis, in their paper, what you see here is a very, the slope here is pretty gentle. These species take quite a long time to reach their maximum photosynthesis rate. If you keep adding light to red maple, it will continue to grow faster. That is typical of shade of less tolerant species. It's not to say that this species can't grow in lower light levels. It can, but it is not going to grow very fast, and it's more likely to be overtaken by other species and outcompeted. Cool. There's one more detail, and I'll come back to this in a little bit. And what they didn't do in their paper is kind of put them all together, on the same kind of cartoon. But if I contextualize this by saying things like American beech and eastern hemlock they're going to saturate quickly. They're going to be competitively favored in low light conditions, and then you can contrast that with your maple, which is going to take a long time to saturate, and then the oaks were in between in this case. And so there's one thing missing here. Well, the way I've depicted this, why wouldn't everything be? Why wouldn't light or shade tolerance always be the strategy to go for? That's the Jeopardy theme song, or whatever. Why wouldn't species always be shade tolerant? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with this this graph?
Some species might not be in shade. Like, what if it's in an open field and it's got as much light as it wants? Good.
And so that's the right thinking. So if you add more light, that's more resource, and certain species are going to be able to take advantage of that better than others. So the way, and this is, I kind of wait to show you this because this is actually how this all plays out. It's kind of messy. There's two things to point out here. One is that at low light levels, certain species have the advantage. They are growing faster under that same level of light. Now, if this was always the case, if everything always maxed out at one maximum growth rate, then there would just be pressure to simply have shade tolerance. But there's no free lunch. There's never a free lunch here. Shade tolerance comes at an expense, and that typically is that trees that are shade tolerant will not grow as fast under high light. So it's a trade-off. Trees with low shade tolerance tend to be able to reach a more rapid maximum growth rate. So they have the advantage in that open field situation that Morgan kind of painted for us. They have a competitive advantage after a clear cut, after many kinds of stand interventions. They may have an advantage after a fire, after something that changes the relative light level. Now, both things exist in nature simultaneously, shade tolerance, low shade tolerance, because nature is really heterogeneous, it's really messy. There are plenty of closed canopy stands where it is advantageous to have shade tolerance so that individual trees can develop in the understory. And then lastly, there's also this intermediate case. That's true too. And there are all kinds of different relationships that happen here. But at different places, each of these trees has a competitive advantage. And that's one of the reasons why we end up with lots of different forest species, lots of different tree species in the canopy. And for that matter, why you can get different canopy species in the same patch of ground over time, over decades or over centuries. Cool. So I want to caution you that it's not always clear cut. It's not always that low shade tolerance comes with sacrifice of low growth and high light conditions. Some species have high shade tolerance and rapid maximum growth. And how can that be? Douglas fir is a relatively shade tolerant species, but it will also grow rapidly. For example, Douglas fir will get established in the understory of many of our broadleaf species, our broadleaf oaks, and it will actually grow through the canopy of these forests over top oaks and then shade them out. How can that be? How can that be evolutionarily sustainable in this landscape? Why doesn't Douglas fir just simply take over the entire world?
It requires the high precipitation levels of like the Pacific Northwest.
It does benefit that, and that controls its macro distribution. But even this is a photograph from Mendocino County, and in many of these forests, it will get established underneath oaks, grow through the canopy, and then overtop them. But Douglas fir hasn't taken over the entirety of Mendocino County yet. This actually happens in Sonoma and Marin too, and it hasn't overtaken them yet. So what else? There's never a free lunch. So what other trade-offs might there be here?
Maybe there's different soils that are factors here. Maybe Douglas fir only prefers a certain soil type that isn't everywhere in Mendocino County.
There's truth to that. There's definitely truth to that. And there are certain soils that may be more favorable for Douglas fir overtaking. But it's overtaking oaks, but it's still not dominating everywhere that it potentially could. Let me show you another example, and we'll see if, then I'll give you the big reveal. High shade tolerance and high growth rate also happens in redwood. It happens in some other species, but redwood's a fairly familiar one. And redwood is, in terms of like these edaphic or climate controls, redwood can't dominate everywhere, especially in the southern portion of its range. Ends up in these deep valleys and so forth. But it does have relatively high shade tolerance. It can grow rapidly, and that helps it dominate in certain conditions, north-facing slopes and so forth. I don't know if this actually helps you kind of get to this, like, why doesn't Douglas fir dominate everywhere in Sonoma County and in Mendocino County? I'll just give you one more chance. Someone else say something. What else could happen that would keep Douglas fir from taking over the world?
Does it need a symbiotic relationship with another organism?
That could help, and they have it. And what you don't, there could be changes in certain ecological relationships that give a species an advantage. Yes, but what you may know, and if you're aware of this, Douglas fir has symbiotic microorganisms that it has in its roots, but it actually shares the same microbes between oaks and Douglas fir. That the same microbes are shared between oaks and Douglas fir. So that is not the reason. I'll give you a hint. It's obvious. If you think about California forests, it's probably the first issue you think about.
Is it elevation?
Oh, it's not elevation because you can't. Elevation stays static. Well, it doesn't. I mean, it changes. It uplifts and stuff, but it changes so slowly that it doesn't. It's not something that would happen every couple of years or every couple of decades.
You
Is
said
it
it's not
fires?
water?
There we are. Yes. There are other factors that influence competition in forests, not just nutrient levels, not just light, but the landscapes are dynamic. And like I say, there's never a free lunch. So some species are better adapted to, dealing with disturbances such as fire. And it's thought that with fire suppression in Sonoma County and Mendocino County, that has led to an increase in Douglas fir density and dominance in a lot of places. And frankly, sometimes in places where we don't want it. So if you're from that part of California, you may have seen these treatments to mitigate Douglas fir invasion. And that's a completely reasonable thing to do to protect biodiversity. So, are soil nutrients important? Yes, absolutely. Does shade tolerance interact, or is shade tolerance or light also? Where am I trying to go here? Light also influences the dynamics of forests, and moisture will too. But it's one of the hard things about ecology is that many different factors are all exacting some sort of force on living things all at once, all simultaneously. Cool. So in our local environment in California, the first and foremost limitation is moisture. And, in Seth's paper, they talk about light limitation, they talk about soil nutrients. They don't talk about moisture limitations. And the reason there is because it rains pretty much year round in those forests. There are ways that local soils will have higher moisture stress, but it's not the first thing. It's probably not the first thing on your mind if you're managing those forests. However, in the West Coast, and especially in Mediterranean environments, probably is. And I would say that it's the single most largest factor that's influencing the dynamics of forests and woody plant communities in general. So this is a photograph from Portugal, and this is the farthest west point in Europe. This is just it's a very dry place. There's a transition from forests into kind of shrublands here. It just gets so dry that forest structure the stature of woody plant communities gets really, really diminished. And then even in the Sierra Nevada, the same thing happens. Getting moisture is a problem. It's a constant source of stress, and it influences the distribution of species. So let's just talk about how plants deal with that. And one of the first things to kind of point out is that, and you guys have already brought this up, but where a forest is located matters. Topography matters. The steepness of a slope influences how rapidly moisture will drain from that slope. It influences the depth of soils, and there's the control of topography on water available is even more complicated than that. So the other kind of obvious thing here that I want to point out is, aspect. So in the northern hemisphere, north-facing aspects are not getting as much solar radiation. I hope you like this. That's original art. I know, I'm good. I know. That, oh, with thumbs up. Yeah, cool. You know, but it's not just like the slope and what direction you're facing, but where you are located on a complex landscape as well. So in flat places, aspect matters less, but the shape of the surrounding landscape can be very important. So being located on the top of a hill, for example, leads to greater runoff of moisture, and so these sites tend to be drier. This is probably not the kind of self-evident, but you know, and then if you're at the bottom of the valley, those sites tend to be wetter. Oops, excuse me, sorry. So in Big Sur, we can get redwood in the valley bottoms because they're wetter and cooler, but on the tops of mountains, you would rarely find redwood. Only in very limited conditions would you ever find redwood. And do you find redwood in uplands? So always very close to the ocean, really foggy places. And this can be quantified. You can actually quantify this in a GIS. There are these metrics called topographic moisture indices. There are lots of different ones out there, TMI. I think there's at least a dozen different ways to calculate it. That's anyway, these tools are out there and you can calculate them, and they can be helpful for sometimes for understanding why trees are occurring in certain places or what kind of management might be useful in a particular piece of land. There are other ones out there that are related to light interception as well. And I haven't actually heard that that you go over those in GIS courses at Cal Poly, but they are around. Who's taken a GIS course? You all have already. Did you do TMI? No? Okay. It's a derived variable. You have to, there are some standard toolbox things that you can just run them within ARC. But it's a derived thing, and it needs to integrate. They typically integrate aspects of landform, elevation, and so forth. And anyway. Okay, so how do plants deal with moisture limitation? The first thing I want to point out here is that moisture availability varies within the year, and this is pretty much always true, except in those wettest of wettest rainforests. It's particularly true in Mediterranean environments. Soil moisture varies just dramatically. It drops down to extremely low levels in the summer. It's hot and doesn't rain here during those periods. The soil characteristics influence moisture availability. So even here, where we have a reliable seasonal drought, the soil still matters. Soil moisture tends to be greater where you have these finer soil textures. And in particular, these loamy soils, which have a fair amount of silt, they tend to store the most water, tend to store the most available water. Now, if you recall from your soil science class, your clay soils hold the absolute highest quantity of water, but it gets locked into that soil really tightly and plants can't necessarily get to it. Higher organic matter content, like I say, organic matter acts as like a sponge, and if you have a lot of organic matter in your soil, that is helpful for retaining more moisture. And then lastly, the depth of soils. Deeper soils, even if they are the worst soils for holding water, even if they are sand, when they are deeper, they will hold more water. And that we can see that effect even locally. This is just showing these graphs are just showing some of the relationships between soil moisture and soil temperature throughout the year. And this is an example from Spain. This is a study where they controlled drought, and they were able to dry out the soils without changing the soil temperature. And this is the graph here. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but it's from the same study. But plants deal with moisture availability changes in different ways, and both evergreen species as well as deciduous species have to do this. In general, and this is probably maybe kind of obvious, but higher soil moisture tends to maintain photosynthesis for longer. And drought, even in soils that tend to hold more moisture, drought reduces growth. In both of those places, when trees can maintain photosynthesis at lower moisture availabilities, they will have an advantage. So understanding which plants can tolerate lower soil moisture levels tells you something, again, about what's going to grow fastest here. What is most likely to be resilient to drought? What is going to meet your management goals of the particular place? And like I say, this is from this study. They introduced drought in these stands, and they measured, this is soil respiration, which is the respiration from roots plus decomposition, and then this is photosynthetic rate. And what I was really impressed with this study is that they introduced drought here, and again, this is in Spain. It's similar climate to here near Cal Poly. They introduced drought, and it really didn't make that much difference in photosynthesis. So, you know, these species are well adapted to drought, and they need a lot of stress in order to compromise them, which is good. I mean, our environment here is very particular. You know, there's a long seasonal drought, and the trees have to be able to cope with that in order to persist. And this is just a little other thing, and especially to put in here because Daniel's here, but plants, I thought this was pretty cool. This is Daniel's old boss. Plants also respond over the course of the day. So giant sequoia photosynthesis is a function of light availability and moisture availability, and moisture availability is higher earlier in the day. So plants will downscale photosynthesis over the course of the day. They respond dynamically to changes in moisture availability. The other interesting thing that happens, and many species at night, many species of trees will actually continue to run some aspects of moisture uptake from the roots, and then they will actually recharge the shallow soil moisture levels to a certain extent, and then utilize that moisture, basically cache moisture in the soil, and then use it the next day to run photosynthesis. It's pretty cool. Yeah. The kind of one of the last concept I want to introduce here is something that you'll hear sometimes, is water use efficiency. Plants vary in how efficiently they turn one molecule of water into, say, one molecule of fixed one unit of fixed carbon. This is the ratio of water used to photosynthesis lost. And in general, the lower the water use efficiency, the faster maximum rate of growth an individual tree will have, or any plant. So especially in drought-prone environments, water use efficiency is a way of talking about the trade-off of being able to grow rapidly when water is not limiting versus how fast you can grow when water is limiting. Which kind of I think also helpful to think of, to keep in mind about it, is that we have plants locally that have very low water use efficiency, and those are a lot of our broadleaf species that occur in upland environments where it's water, they just kind of would most plants would run out of water by the end of the summer. But we also have plants that have just they're very poor, or sorry, that's low water use efficiency. I meant to say very high water use efficiency, so plants in the uplands. But we also have plants that are have low water use efficiency, and those are our riparian species. By definition, those species cannot persist without contact with perennial sources of water. And one of the reasons is because they're relying on that constant source of water to maintain their tissues. So again, just like light limitation, both high water use efficiency plants and low water use efficiency plants end up persisting in the same place in time. And this is just a figure, kind of a segue into our topic for next week. But what this is showing here is the water potential measured before the dawn, and then relationship with drought. And this is just making the point that if you increase temperature, you can increase the severity or the biological effects of drought. What they were able to do here is kill plants a lot faster when they cranked up the temperature while also introducing drought. And that is and that's just to point out that increasing temperatures may change the calculus in many of our plant communities that are adapted to seasonal droughts, because higher temperature droughts are more stressful. And then down here, there's just some forecasts of drought intensity, and just pointing out if when the temperatures are higher, plants in many of our western forests are less able to cope with drought. We'll come back to that next week. And this is just to kind of, I just want to pull this back and just point out one more time. We have we have high shade tolerance here, but low maximum growth rates. And then we got low shade tolerance in these other species, but they reach higher maximum growth rates. So after a clear cut or something, or some disturbance that changes light levels in these eastern forests, red maple and even some ashes are favored. And in fact, in eastern forests, there has been a shift towards greater and greater dominance of red maple over the last several decades. So even though it's relatively shade intolerant species, it's doing just fine. It's growing all over the place and really dominating. And you can see these kinds of trade-offs in lots of different places. Sometimes they happen right next to each other. These are just some extremes here. Cottonwood has some of the lowest water use efficiency. Things like creosote have some of the highest water use efficiencies. They can occur in relatively close proximity, and that's because of something that has to do with the subterranean flows of water. And then the last thing I'll point out is that, kind of bringing this back to nutrients, I don't want to give you the impression that nutrients don't matter in our western forests. They do, but and that's why I kind of wanted to, one of the reasons why I wanted to preface this whole part of the class by saying that, what are the most important limitations to tree growth? Number one, nutrients. Number one, also water. Number one, also light. They're all tied. They're all important, and which one is relatively more important is going to depend on where you are. There is, you can talk about nutrient use efficiency in the same way that you can water use efficiency, and it's just how well does a plant grow given a certain unit of nutrients. So this is actually a photograph from West Cuesta, just a few miles, a mile or two above here in the botanical area, on serpentine soils, where actually nitrogen nutrients are probably the most important limitation to tree growth in this particular forest. So it does happen here even locally, and that's because these soils they're just really harsh. There are barely, almost no nutrients, almost no nitrogen or phosphorus there. So I hope I didn't muddle the message too much. All three are tied for number one. And if you look for places for the supremacy of one over the other, you're gonna find it. Even in eastern forests, you can find areas where water limitation is influencing which species are dominant. And in practice, it's gonna fall to you as a manager, as a natural resource manager, as a forest manager, to figure out which one is the most important and which one do you, put another way, which one do you need to worry about for your management objectives. Okay, cool. So actually we ended up going pretty much the full time here. The stuff that I have online for this week is a little bit shorter. Next week, I might have to put more of it onto the YouTube channel just because we're also going to be having our one-on-one conversations. So we won't meet on Monday, but we will meet as normal for lecture. And please just, if I can ask you to muddle through this clunky method of signing up for a time to call. And remember, if the times that are there don't work for you, we'll figure something out. We're a nimble group. Cool. I'm going to stop the video.